Keanu continued speaking, and everyone in the studio could feel that something important was happening. This wasn't just an interview anymore. It was a moment of real human connection, the kind that reaches through television screens and touches people in their living rooms and bedrooms and wherever they might be watching. "When your father leaves and doesn't come back," Keanu said, "you spend a lot of time wondering what was wrong with you, what you did that made him go, what you could have done differently to make him stay. Even when you're old enough to understand that it wasn't your fault, that you were just a child and children aren't responsible for their parents' choices. There's still this voice in the back of your head asking why you weren't enough." He looked down at his hands, then back up at the audience. "I think that's why I became the way I am, why I try to be kind to people, why I don't take success for granted, why I treat everyone with respect regardless of who they are or what they do, because I know what it feels like to be discarded, to be treated like you don't matter, and I never want to make anyone else feel that way." Jimmy nodded slowly. "So all those stories people tell about you, the kindness, the generosity, the way you treat people, that all comes from this?" "In a way, yes," Keanu agreed. "I mean, I'd like to think I'd be a decent person anyway. But this definitely shaped it. When you grow up feeling invisible to the one person who's supposed to see you most clearly, you become very aware of other people's pain. You recognize when someone feels overlooked or undervalued because you've been there yourself." He smiled slightly, a sad but genuine expression. "My mother used to work multiple jobs to support us. I watched her struggle, watched her sacrifice everything to give us a stable life. My sister and I, we learned early that family isn't about biology. It's about who shows up, who stays, who chooses you every day even when it's hard." The audience was completely absorbed now. Several people were nodding along, recognizing their own experiences in what Keanu was describing. A woman in the third row was holding her daughter close, both of them crying. A man near the back had his hand over his mouth, visibly moved. "I found my real family over the years," Keanu continued. "Friends who became brothers and sisters, colleagues who became mentors and teachers, people who chose to be in my life not because they had to, but because they wanted to. And I learned that those connections, the ones we build ourselves, can be just as strong as the ones we're born into. Sometimes stronger." Jimmy leaned forward. "Have you ever tried to find him? Your father? To get answers or closure or whatever that might look like?" Keanu was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "I thought about it over the years, especially when I was younger. I'd imagine conversations we might have, things I might say, questions I might ask." He paused. "But as I got older, I realized that any answer he could give me wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't undo the years of wondering. It wouldn't heal the child who waited for phone calls that never came. Whatever his reasons were, they were his, and I had to find a way to make peace with not knowing them." "That's incredibly mature," Jimmy said. "I don't know about mature," Keanu replied with a slight laugh. "More like necessary. You can't spend your whole life waiting for closure from someone who's never going to give it to you. At some point, you have to give it to yourself." He shifted in his chair, sitting up straighter. "I think that's what today was about, actually. That question you asked, it forced me to confront something I'd been avoiding for decades. Not just in interviews, but in myself. I'd built this wall around that part of my life, told myself it was private and sacred and not for public consumption. But really, I was just scared. Scared of feeling that pain again. Scared of appearing weak or broken or damaged. And now?" Jimmy asked gently. "Now I feel lighter," Keanu said. And there was surprise in his voice, like he was discovering this as he said it. "Exposed, yes. Vulnerable, definitely. But also lighter. Like I've been carrying this heavy thing around for so long that I forgot it was there. And now that I've put it down, I can breathe a little easier." The audience started applauding again, but Keanu held up a hand. "Can I say something else? To anyone watching who might be dealing with something similar." The applause faded and everyone waited to hear what he would say. "If you grew up without a parent, or with a parent who wasn't really present, or in any situation where you felt abandoned or unwanted, I want you to know that it wasn't your fault," Keanu said, looking directly into the camera. "Children don't drive parents away. Parents make their own choices, and sometimes those choices hurt people who don't deserve to be hurt. You deserved better. You deserved to be chosen and cherished and made to feel like you mattered." His voice was steady and clear, each word deliberate. "And I want you to know that you can build a good life anyway. You can be happy. You can love and be loved. The absence of someone, even someone as important as a parent, doesn't have to define your entire story. It's part of your story, yes, but it's not the whole story. You get to write the rest of it yourself. There wasn't a dry eye in the studio now. Even the camera operators were wiping their faces. The director in the control booth was crying. The security guards at the exits were trying to be discreet about their emotions, but failing. This moment had transcended television. It had become something bigger than entertainment or celebrity gossip. It had become a shared human experience. I spent so much of my life hiding this, Keanu continued, thinking that if people knew about my father, about that abandonment, they'd see me differently. They'd think I was broken or damaged or less than. But what I'm realizing right here, right now, is that everyone's a little broken. Everyone's carrying something. And maybe the bravest thing we can do is stop pretending we're not. Jimmy had given up trying to hide his own tears. Thank you for sharing this, he said. I know I speak for everyone here when I say that this means more than you probably know. Keanu nodded. Thank you for asking the question. Even though it was hard, even though it broke me open for a minute there, I think I needed it. Sometimes we need someone to ask the question we've been avoiding asking ourselves. What happens now? Jimmy asked. After this airs, after this moment becomes public. Are you worried about that? Keanu thought about it. A part of me is terrified, he admitted. Tomorrow everyone's going to know this thing I've kept private my whole career. There will be headlines and articles and probably a lot of analysis from people who don't know me. That's scary. He paused. But another part of me feels relieved. Like I've been carrying a secret that was making me heavy. And now it's not a secret anymore. I can stop protecting it. I can just let it be part of my story instead of this hidden thing I'm ashamed of. You have nothing to be ashamed of, Jimmy said firmly. I know that now. Keanu replied. I mean, I knew it intellectually before, but I feel it now. There's a difference. He looked out at the audience. Thank you all for being here for this. For witnessing it. For not making me feel like I need to apologize for being human. The audience rose to their feet again, this time in a standing ovation that lasted for nearly a full minute. Keanu stood too, waving slightly, overwhelmed by the support. Jimmy came around and embraced him, a genuine hug between two people who just shared something profound. When they finally sat back down, Jimmy looked at his cards and laughed. I had all these other questions prepared, but they all seem pretty meaningless now. Keanu laughed too, a real laugh that showed he was genuinely okay. We can talk about the movie if you want. That's why I came here originally. Tell you what, Jimmy said. Let's just end here. This feels like the right place to end. And it was. They said their goodbyes, the show went to commercial, and Keanu walked off stage to another standing ovation. But this time he wasn't running away. He was walking with his head up, waving to people, even stopping to hug a few audience members who'd been particularly moved by his story. Backstage, the crew crowded around him, not in an intrusive way, but in a way that showed they wanted him to know he wasn't alone. The production assistant who'd cried earlier told him about her own father who'd left. The veteran stagehand shared that he'd never met his dad either. One by one, people shared their own stories, creating a circle of understanding and support around this man who'd just shown them his deepest wound. Over the next few days, the interview would become one of the most watched segments in late-night television history. It would be shared millions of times across social media. Mental health organizations would use it as an example of the importance of vulnerability. Support groups for people with absent parents would reference it. Keanu Reeves, already beloved, would become even more so, not despite his brokenness, but because of his willingness to show it. But in that moment, backstage at Jimmy Kimmel Live, none of that mattered. What mattered was that a man who'd spent 50 years carrying a painful secret had finally put it down, and in doing so, he'd given permission to millions of others to do the same. The question hung in the air while Keanu considered his options. He could walk away right now, leave the studio, go home, and never talk about this again. That's what the old Keanu would have done, the one who had spent decades protecting himself. Behind walls of privacy and carefully controlled public appearances, that version of himself would have apologized again, made his exit quietly, and pretended this moment never happened. But something had shifted in the last few minutes. Maybe it was finally saying his father's name out loud after all these years. Maybe it was the feeling of release that came from letting those tears fall instead of holding them back. Or maybe it was seeing the faces of the crew members around him, seeing his own pain reflected in their eyes, understanding that he wasn't alone in carrying this kind of hurt. He looked around at the people gathered nearby. the production assistant who'd been crying. The veteran stagehand who'd seen everything but was moved by this. The makeup artist who'd offered tissues. The sound technician wiping her own tears. All these people who worked behind the scenes, who made television happen, who were just trying to do their jobs and get through their own days. They all had their own stories, their own absent parents or broken families or unanswered questions. Then he looked back at Jimmy, who was still standing there patiently, asking nothing, just being present. Jimmy, who'd accidentally opened this door but was now offering him every possible way out if he wanted it. No pressure, no judgment, just genuine human concern. Keanu took a deep breath, and when he spoke, his voice was clearer than it had been since he walked off stage. "I want to go back out there." Jimmy's eyebrows went up in surprise. "Are you sure?" "There's no pressure to." "I'm sure," Keanu said, cutting him off gently. "I've spent 50 years not talking about this. Running from it, hiding it. And where has that gotten me?" He gestured to himself, to his red eyes and tear-stained face. "It all came out anyway. Just on national television instead of somewhere private where I could have dealt with it on my own terms." He wiped his face one more time, straightening his shirt. "If I walk away now, this moment becomes the story. Keanu Reeves cries and runs away. That's the headline. That's what people remember." He paused, thinking. "But if I go back out there and actually talk about it, really talk about it, then maybe the story becomes something else. Something more useful." A producer had appeared, listening to this exchange. She looked between Keanu and Jimmy uncertainly. "We're about to come back from commercial," she said. "If we're going to continue, we need to know now." Jimmy ignored her, keeping his focus on Keanu. "You really want to do this? You don't owe anyone an explanation or a performance. You can just go home." "I know," Keanu said. "But I think I owe it to myself, and maybe to other people who've been through something similar." He managed a small, genuine smile. "Besides, I've never left an interview unfinished before. I'm not starting now." Jimmy studied his face for another moment, making sure this was really what Keanu wanted and not just what he thought he should do. Whatever he saw there must have convinced him, because he nodded. "Okay, but the second you want to stop, we stop. No questions asked." "Deal," Keanu said. The producer spoke urgently into her headset, telling the control room that they were continuing. The crew that had been standing around quickly moved back to their positions. The makeup artist rushed forward with powder and a quick touch-up, doing what she could to minimize the evidence of tears under the harsh studio lights. Keanu stood still while she worked, his expression calm now, almost meditative. As they walked back toward the stage, Jimmy put a hand on Keanu's shoulder again. "Thank you for trusting me with this," he said quietly. "I promise I won't waste it." They emerged from backstage just as the commercial break was ending. The audience, who had been sitting in uncertain silence, erupted into spontaneous applause when they saw Keanu returning. It wasn't the excited applause of fans seeing a celebrity. It was something deeper, warmer. It was the sound of people showing support for someone who had just shown them his most vulnerable self. Many people in the audience were standing now, still clapping. Some had tears on their own faces. Keanu paused for a moment, seeming surprised by the reaction. He raised a hand in acknowledgement, a small gesture of gratitude, and made his way back to the guest chair. Jimmy followed, and they both sat down as the applause continued for several more seconds before gradually fading. The cameras were rolling again. Millions of people who had been watching at home were now back, tuning in to see what would happen next. Social media was already exploding with speculation and concern. But in the studio, there was a feeling of anticipation mixed with respect. Whatever was about to happen felt significant. Jimmy looked at Keanu, giving him one last chance to change his mind. Keanu gave a small nod, indicating he was ready. Jimmy turned to address the audience and the cameras. "Welcome back," he said, his tone more serious than usual. "As you can see, Keanu has rejoined us, and I want to say that what you're about to hear took a lot of courage to share. So I just want to thank him for that before we even start." Keanu took a breath. "I want to apologize," he began, looking directly into the camera. "Not for the emotion, actually, but for walking off. That wasn't fair to you, Jimmy, or to everyone here, but the truth is that question caught me completely off guard in a way I wasn't prepared for." Jimmy shook his head. "You don't need to apologize, and let me finish," Keanu said gently. "Please, because I think I need to say this." He paused, gathering his thoughts. I've done hundreds of interviews over the years, maybe thousands. And in every single one, there's been this invisible line I draw, topics I won't discuss, questions I deflect, parts of my life that are off limits. And one of the biggest parts has always been my father. The audience was completely silent, leaning forward in their seats. This level of honesty, this kind of raw vulnerability from someone usually so guarded, was unprecedented. His name was Samuel, Keanu continued, and saying it again seemed easier this time. Samuel Nolan Reeves Jr. He left my family when I was 3 years old. I barely remember him from that time. Just fragments, really. A voice, a presence, the feeling of being picked up, but nothing concrete enough to hold on to. He was speaking steadily now, his voice strong despite the emotion still visible in his eyes. When I was 13, he came back. Just showed up one day. My mother let him see us, me and my sister. I remember being so excited, thinking that he'd realized his mistake, that he was there to be my dad again. Keanu's voice wavered slightly, but he pushed through. We spent maybe 3 or 4 hours together. He asked about school, about my interests. I told him everything. Probably talked too much, trying to give him reasons to stay. To show him I was worth knowing, he paused, and then he left. Said he'd call, said he'd visit again soon, and I never saw him after that day. You could hear people in the audience crying now, not bothering to hide it. Jimmy's own eyes were glistening as he listened. For years I made excuses, Keanu went on. Told myself stories about why he didn't come back. Maybe he was in trouble. Maybe something prevented him. Maybe he wanted to but couldn't. It took me a long time to accept the simple truth, which is that he just chose not to be part of our lives. He had other children later, other families. He was capable of being a father. He just didn't want to be mine. The words hung heavy in the air, but there was something almost peaceful in the way Keanu said them, like he was finally stating a truth he'd spent decades dancing around. That absence shaped everything about me, he said. The backstage area of a television studio is usually a busy place. People rushing back and forth, crews moving equipment, guests waiting for their moment to go on. But right now it felt frozen. Everyone had stopped what they were doing. Producers stood with clipboards hanging at their sides. Camera operators had left their stations. Sound technicians had removed their headphones. They were all just standing there, processing what had just happened. Near the craft services table, a young production assistant who couldn't have been more than 25 years old had tears streaming down her face. She'd been working in television for 3 years, had seen countless celebrities come through these halls, but she'd never seen anything like this. Next to her, a veteran stagehand who'd been doing this job for 30 years just shook his head slowly. He'd seen performers have breakdowns before, but there was something different about this. Something more real. Keanu stood in that corner, trying to collect himself. He had his back to most of the hallway, one hand pressed against the wall like he needed the support. His breathing was uneven, coming in short bursts that he was trying to control. Every few seconds he would wipe at his face as if he could somehow erase what was happening. But the tears kept coming, and with them came something that had been buried for so long it had almost become part of his foundation. A makeup artist who had worked with Keanu earlier in the evening approached carefully, holding out a box of tissues. She didn't say anything, just offered them with a kind expression. Keanu took them with a nod, unable to speak yet. She stepped back respectfully, giving him space but staying close enough that he knew he wasn't alone. That's when Jimmy rounded the corner. He'd taken off his jacket and loosened his tie, and his face showed none of the television personality polish it had during the show. This was just one person checking on another person. He slowed as he approached, not wanting to startle or overwhelm Keanu. He stopped a few feet away and waited, giving Keanu the choice of whether to acknowledge him or not. After a moment, Keanu turned slightly enough to see Jimmy standing there. His eyes were red and still wet with tears. His face showed the kind of pain that comes from something deep and old, something that's been waiting a long time to finally break free. He tried to say something but had to stop and take a breath first. Then another. "I'm sorry," Keanu finally managed, his voice rough and unsteady. "I didn't mean to. I shouldn't have." Jimmy raised a hand gently, stopping him. "Don't apologize. Please don't apologize." His voice was quiet, sincere. "I'm the one who should be sorry. I had no idea that question would..." Keanu shook his head, wiping at his face again with the tissues. "It's not your fault, Jimmy, it's really not." He took another breath, steadier this time. You couldn't have known. A producer appeared behind Jimmy, trying to get his attention about the show's schedule, but Jimmy waved her away without even turning around. Right now, the show didn't matter. The ratings didn't matter. Nothing mattered except making sure Keanu was okay. Is there anything I can do? Jimmy asked. Water? Do you want to sit down? We can end the interview, obviously. We don't have to air any of this. Keanu let out a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. I've never done that before, he said, almost to himself. In all these years, all these interviews, I've never... Jimmy waited, not pushing, just being present. Around them, crew members kept their distance but stayed nearby. A silent show of support for someone they'd always heard was one of the kindest people in the business. Now they were seeing a different side of that kindness. The cost of being someone who cares so deeply about others while keeping his own pain locked away. Keanu turned to face Jimmy more fully now. His breathing was getting more under control, though his eyes still glistened. I've never said his name out loud on camera before, he explained. Never talked about that part of my life where everyone could hear it. The admission hung in the air between them. Jimmy nodded slowly, beginning to understand the magnitude of what had just happened. This wasn't just about one question or one difficult topic. This was about a lifetime of carefully maintained boundaries, all of them coming down at once on national television. His name was Samuel, Keanu continued, and saying it seemed to cost him something. Samuel Nowlin Reeves, Jr., my father. He paused, looking down at the crumpled tissues in his hands. He left when I was 3, just left. And except for one time when I was 13, I never saw him again. Jimmy felt his own throat tighten. He'd read the basic facts during show prep, but hearing it said like this in this moment made it real in a way that research notes never could. That one time, when you were 13, Jimmy said quietly. What happened? Keanu looked up, and there was something in his eyes now beyond just sadness. It was the look of someone who had carried a question their whole life without ever getting an answer. He showed up out of nowhere, spent a few hours with me and my sister, said he wanted to be part of our lives again. He paused, and a bitter smile crossed his face. Then he left again, and that was it. Never heard from him after that. A sound technician who'd been standing nearby quickly turned away, wiping at her own eyes. Others who could hear the conversation were doing the same. There was something about hearing this incredibly famous, beloved person talk about such fundamental human pain that made it impossible not to feel it too. I was just a kid, Keanu went on, the words coming more easily now like a dam had broken. I remember waiting after he left that second time, thinking he'd call or write or something. I made up excuses for why he didn't. Maybe he lost our number. Maybe he was sick. Maybe something happened and he couldn't reach us. He shook his head. It took me years to accept that he just didn't want to be there, that we weren't enough reason for him to stay. Jimmy didn't know what to say. What could anyone say to that? He reached out and put a hand on Keanu's shoulder. A simple gesture of solidarity and support. The thing is, Keanu continued, his voice getting stronger even as more tears fell, I built my whole life around that absence. Every choice I made, every relationship, every role I took, it was all shaped by this hole where a father should have been. And I thought if I just never talked about it, if I just kept it private and locked away, it wouldn't have power over me anymore. He laughed again, that same broken sound. But it turns out that's not how it works. You don't heal from something by pretending it doesn't exist. You just get really good at hiding the wound. By now, a small group had gathered at a respectful distance, not because they were trying to eavesdrop, but because what was happening felt important. Keanu Reeves, the man who had spent decades being strong for everyone else, was finally showing his own vulnerability, and in doing so, he was giving permission for others to acknowledge their own pain too. One of the security guards, a large man who looked like he'd never cried in his life, was wiping his eyes. A camera operator was hugging one of the writers. The production assistant who'd been crying earlier had been joined by several others. This wasn't just about Keanu anymore. It was about all the people who had absent parents, who had unanswered questions, who had learned to build their lives around the shape of what was missing. I became an actor partly because of it, Keanu said, looking at Jimmy but also seeming to talk to himself. Playing other people, being someone else, it felt safer than being me. When you're pretending to be a character, nobody asks about your real life. Nobody wants to know about your father who left, or your mother who had to work 3 jobs, or the family that fell apart before you were old enough to understand why. Jimmy nodded, understanding. And you became really good at it. At being other people? Yeah, Keanu agreed. I became really good at it. Too good, maybe. I got so used to being whoever people needed me to be that I forgot how to just be myself. The real me with all the broken parts and questions and pain. He straightened up a little, standing taller. The tears had slowed now, though his eyes were still red. There was something different in his posture, though. Like saying these things out loud, finally giving voice to what he'd carried silently for so long, had lifted some weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. What do you want to do? Jimmy asked after a moment. We're still on commercial break. We can end the interview here. Nobody would blame you. Keanu was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Around them, everyone waited to hear what he would say. Jimmy Kimmel had done thousands of interviews over his career. He knew how to read people, how to sense when to push forward and when to pull back. But sometimes, even with all that experience, you can't predict how someone will respond to a question. He looked at Keanu, who was still talking warmly about his mother and sister, and felt like maybe this was the right moment to ask something nobody had really asked before. He waited for a natural pause in the conversation, then leaned forward slightly. His voice took on a gentler tone, the kind you use when you know you're stepping into sensitive territory. He started by acknowledging that family shapes us in complex ways, both through presence and absence. The audience was completely silent now, sensing the shift in energy. Even the usual sounds of shuffling and quiet whispers had stopped. Then Jimmy asked the question. It was phrased carefully, respectfully. He mentioned that he understood Keanu's father hadn't been part of his life growing up. He asked if Keanu ever thought about that, about what it meant, about whether he'd ever wanted to reach out or if there were things left unsaid. The question hung in the air like smoke, visible and tangible but impossible to grab onto. For a moment, nothing changed. Keanu's expression remained neutral, that same calm face he'd worn throughout the interview. But if you were watching closely, really closely, you could see something flicker across his features. It was brief, maybe half a second, but it was there, a tightening around his eyes, a slight shift in how he was holding his jaw. These were the tiny tells of someone who had just been caught completely off guard. Keanu opened his mouth to respond. The audience waited. The camera stayed focused on his face, capturing every micro-expression. But no words came out. He closed his mouth again, looked down at his hands for a moment, then back up at Jimmy. He tried again to speak, and this time a single word made it out before stopping. Just one word that would change everything about this interview. My father. The way he said it was different from how he'd been speaking all evening. There was a weight to those two words that hadn't been present in anything else he'd discussed. Not when talking about intense action scenes or emotional movie moments. Not when discussing his work or his hobbies. This was different. This was real in a way that nothing else had been. He paused again, and this pause felt longer than it probably was. Time has a funny way of stretching out when something important is happening. Keanu's eyes, which had been so steady and controlled throughout the entire interview, started to change. They became shinier, catching the studio lights in a way they hadn't before. Anyone who had ever tried to hold back tears in public knew exactly what was happening. Jimmy realized immediately that something was wrong. Not wrong like the interview was going badly, but wrong like he'd just accidentally opened a door that had been locked for a very good reason. He started to say something, maybe to change the subject or offer an out, but Keanu was already speaking again. My father was... Another pause, longer this time. Keanu's voice had changed too. It was quieter, more strained. He was fighting something and losing. He was gone before I could... The sentence died unfinished. Keanu looked down again, and when he looked back up, there was no hiding it anymore. A tear had formed and was now slowly making its way down his cheek. In the harsh lights of the television studio, it was impossible to miss. This man who had played stoic heroes and tough guys, who had maintained such incredible composure through decades of fame, was crying on national television. The audience didn't know how to react. Should they look away out of respect? Should they offer support somehow? They sat frozen, watching something that felt almost too private to witness. This wasn't acting. This wasn't a movie scene. This was a human being having a very real, very raw moment in front of millions of people. Keanu quickly reached up and wiped the tear away, as if he could somehow erase what was happening. He shook his head. a small movement that seemed to be directed at himself more than anyone else, like he was trying to physically shake off the emotion that was overwhelming him, but it wasn't working. More tears were coming and his breathing had changed, becoming slightly uneven in that way that happens when you're trying desperately not to cry, but your body won't cooperate. Jimmy had completely abandoned his note cards now. He was leaning forward, his face showing genuine concern. This wasn't about getting good television anymore. This was about a human being in distress, and Jimmy's instincts as a decent person were kicking in. He started to reach out to offer some kind of comfort or reassurance, but Keanu was already moving. He stood up from the guest chair with a sudden motion that startled everyone. His face was a mixture of embarrassment, pain, and something that looked like panic. He wasn't looking at Jimmy anymore, or at the audience, or at the cameras. He was looking toward the exit from the stage like a person who suddenly realizes they need to get out of a room right now. "I'm sorry," he said, and his voice was barely above a whisper. The microphone caught it, though, and it went out to everyone watching. Two simple words that carried so much emotion they felt heavy. "I can't." "I need a moment." Nobody stopped him. What could they do? You don't force someone to stay when they're clearly in that kind of emotional state. Keanu walked off the stage with quick, purposeful steps. Not running exactly, but definitely moving faster than his usual relaxed pace. The cameras followed him for a few seconds before cutting away, uncertain of what they were supposed to be filming now. The audience sat in stunned silence. Many of them had tears in their own eyes now, moved by the raw authenticity of what they'd just witnessed. In an age of carefully managed celebrity images and PR-approved soundbites, they had just seen something completely unscripted and real. They had seen Keanu Reeves, one of the most famous actors in the world, break down over something that clearly ran far deeper than any role he'd ever played. Jimmy stood up too, running a hand through his hair in a gesture that betrayed his own stress and concern. He looked at the cameras, at his audience, at his crew. Everyone was looking to him for guidance on what to do next. He made a quick decision. "We're going to take a break," he said, his voice lacking its usual jovial tone. The floor manager immediately signaled for a commercial, and the live feed cut away. The second they were off air, the studio erupted in quiet chaos. Crew members were talking in urgent whispers. Producers were rushing around with headsets trying to figure out what the protocol was for this kind of situation. Nobody had a playbook for what to do when one of the most beloved celebrities in the world walks off your set in tears. Jimmy didn't hesitate. He immediately headed backstage, following the path Keanu had taken. His producers called after him, asking what he wanted to do about the rest of the show, whether they should bring out the next guest early, whether they should cut the segment entirely. He waved them off. Right now, none of that mattered. What mattered was checking on someone who was clearly hurting. The audience remained in their seats, unsure if they should stay or go. Some were crying. Others were just sitting in shocked silence. A few were already pulling out their phones, though the ushers quickly moved to remind them about the no-recording policy. This moment, whatever it was, had affected everyone in that studio. They had come expecting a fun late-night interview with a movie star. Instead, they had witnessed something much more profound and painful. Backstage, past the cameras and lights and the facade of the television set, Keanu had found a quiet corner away from the main pathways. He was there alone, his back partially turned to the hallway. His shoulders were shaking slightly. Decades of carefully maintained composure had cracked wide open, and now everything he'd been holding back was pouring out. The bright lights of the Jimmy Kimmel Live studio felt warmer than usual that evening. There was something electric in the air, though nobody could quite put their finger on what it was. The audience had been waiting for this moment all week. Keanu Reeves was scheduled to appear, and for millions of people around the world that meant something special. This wasn't just another celebrity stopping by to promote their latest project. This was Keanu, the man who had somehow managed to remain genuinely humble and kind, despite decades of fame and fortune. Behind the scenes, production assistants rushed around making final checks. The cameras were positioned perfectly. The sound engineers tested their equipment one last time. Everything had to be just right. Jimmy Kimmel himself was in his dressing room, going over his notes and questions. His team had spent days researching, preparing topics that would make for good television, while still respecting the boundaries that Keanu had always maintained around his personal life. When the show's theme music started playing, the audience erupted into applause. Jimmy walked out with his signature energy, waving to the crowd and cracking a few jokes to warm everyone up. He went through his monologue, hitting all the right notes, getting laughs in all the expected places. But there was a sense of anticipation building. Everyone knew who was coming up after the commercial break. The stage manager counted down with her fingers. 3, 2, 1. The cameras came back on and Jimmy turned to face them with a smile. He began his introduction, talking about his next guest's incredible career, his legendary roles in movies that had defined generations. He mentioned the Matrix trilogy, the John Wick series, and so many other films that had made Keanu a household name. But he also talked about something else, something that had made Keanu even more beloved than his movies ever could. The kindness, the generosity, the random acts of goodness that people witnessed and shared online. There was the time he gave up his seat on the subway to a woman with a heavy bag. The moment he sat on the curb eating a birthday cupcake alone, looking so peaceful and content. The stories of him taking pay cuts so that other crew members could get better salaries. The way he treated fans with genuine respect and patience, never making anyone feel like they were bothering him. These weren't PR stunts or calculated moves. They were just who he was. When Jimmy finally said his name and the band started playing, the audience went wild. People stood up, clapping and cheering as Keanu walked out from backstage. He was dressed simply, as always. Nothing flashy or designer. Just a man who happened to be one of the biggest movie stars in the world, but somehow never acted like it. He waved to the audience with a slight, almost shy smile, and made his way to the guest chair. Jimmy stood up to shake his hand, and they embraced briefly the way old friends do. Keanu sat down, settling into the chair with a relaxed posture that suggested he was comfortable, though anyone who had watched enough of his interviews knew that he always carried a certain guardedness about him, not in an unfriendly way, but more like someone who had learned to protect certain parts of himself from the world. The conversation started easily enough. Jimmy asked about his latest film project, and Keanu answered with his characteristic thoughtfulness. He didn't just give quick, superficial answers. He actually talked about the work, about the people he collaborated with, about what drew him to the role. He spoke about his stunt coordinators and his fellow actors with genuine appreciation and respect. Every time Jimmy tried to steer the praise toward Keanu himself, he would deflect it, turning the attention back to the team effort that went into making movies. The audience laughed when they were supposed to laugh. They listened intently when Keanu shared stories from the set. There was something captivating about the way he spoke, never rushed, always considered. He had a way of making you feel like you were having a conversation with him in a coffee shop, rather than watching him on national television. Jimmy brought up the internet's obsession with Keanu, all those memes and viral moments that had turned him into something of a folk hero. Keanu smiled and shook his head slightly, clearly a bit embarrassed by all the attention. He said something about how people were very kind, and how he was just trying to live his life the same way anyone else would. The humility wasn't an act. You could see it in his eyes, hear it in his voice. He genuinely didn't understand what all the fuss was about. They talked about motorcycles, one of Keanu's well-known passions. His eyes lit up a little when discussing his motorcycle company and the process of building bikes. There was real joy there, the kind that comes from doing something you love regardless of whether it makes you money or adds to your fame. Jimmy asked about his love of books, and Keanu spoke about literature with the same enthusiasm, mentioning authors and stories that had stayed with him over the years. The conversation was going well. Really well. It had that natural flow that makes for great television, where you forget you're watching an interview and just feel like you're eavesdropping on an interesting conversation between two people. The audience was engaged, leaning forward in their seats, hanging on every word. Even the crew members who had seen countless celebrity interviews were paying closer attention than usual. Jimmy glanced down at his note cards, the ones his research team had prepared. They had suggested going a bit deeper, talking about Keanu's background and childhood. It was risky territory. Keanu had always been intensely private about his personal life, especially his family. He rarely discussed his past in detail. But Jimmy's team thought that maybe, with the right approach, they could have a meaningful conversation that would give people a glimpse into what shaped this remarkable man. Jimmy looked up from his cards and back at Keanu. He decided to go for it. He started talking about childhood influences, about the people who help make us who we become. Keanu nodded along, still relaxed but perhaps paying closer attention now. Jimmy mentioned that he'd read about Keanu's mother, about how strong she must have been. Keanu's expression softened immediately when his mother was mentioned. He spoke about her with clear love and admiration, talking about her resilience and her determination to give her children a good life, despite the challenges they faced. The audience could feel something shifting in the conversation. It was getting more personal, more real. This wasn't the usual late-night banter anymore. They were watching something deeper unfold. Keanu continued talking about his mother, about his sister, about the small family unit that had meant everything to him growing up. His voice was steady, but there was emotion underneath it, carefully controlled but definitely present. Jimmy listened, nodding along, and then he looked down at his notes again. There was another question there, one that would take the conversation even deeper. He had no way of knowing what was about to happen. None of them did. The cameras kept rolling. The audience stayed quiet, sensing that something important was building. And Keanu sat there, unaware that in just a few moments he would be confronting something he had spent his entire public life avoiding.